So the first week of March is behind us, and Bitcoin did something we have been talking about for a while. It got a counter-trend rally. And at the same time, we also started seeing ETF inflows return during the first week of March, which was another thing we have been watching closely. But now the big question is this: was that the rally or just the beginning of it? Because when we look at this counter-trend rally, so far it hasn't been impressive. From the lower low we put in earlier this year, Bitcoin has only rallied about 24% before running into resistance around 74,000. And from there, price started to slow down. Now, don't get me wrong, a 24% move is still a solid rally. But when you compare to what Bitcoin has historically done during the same time in the cycle, it's actually relatively small. And that's where the historical context becomes interesting. My base case has always been that Bitcoin will follow a similar structure to what it has done in previous cycles. Not exactly, of course, every cycle has its own differences, but the overall rhythm of the market tends to repeat. And so far in this cycle, Bitcoin has continued to do what it has always done. That's why in my last video I looked at different perspectives of how this cycle could continue to play out. One of the key things we have talked about is how March often brings a counter-trend rally in midterm years. But in those videos I mainly focused on the weekly time frame, which gives a great macro view of the market, but doesn't of course show shorter term moves. So this time I decided to zoom in and have a look at the daily time frame instead. And interestingly enough, the daily time frame tells a very similar story. Historically, during midterm years, Bitcoin tends to put in a low in late January or early February. And then we usually see a counter-trend rally in the first week of March. In 2014, Bitcoin rallied until March 3rd before rolling over again. In 2018, the rally lasted until March 5th, and in 2022 the rally lasted until March 2nd. Now the 2022 case is especially interesting because while the first rally happened during the first week of March, later in that same month Bitcoin actually came back and swept that high again before eventually moving lower. But the key point here is that in the first week of March in every midterm year we got this rally, and once again that is exactly what we saw this time again. However, there is one important detail that stands out. Those rallies in previous cycles were much stronger. In some cases they ranged anywhere from 40% all the way up to nearly 100% from the lows. But so far here in 2026, after the first week of March, Bitcoin has only moved about 24% before starting to slow down. And that's the part that makes me think that it's not finished yet. Now, my personal target for this counter-trend rally was around the bear market resistance band, which currently sits around $80,000 or above that. The idea was Bitcoin was going to go to the resistance band before eventually rolling over again. But the challenge right now is that the rally we have seen so far has been really weak, especially, like I said, compared to these previous cycles. And we have also talked about how these indicators are sitting at extreme low levels right now. And this rally didn't really make them reset. Usually before we see a large move lower, these indicators tend to reset either through a strong rally or some sideways price action. But right now we haven't really seen either of those things. And that's why I think another scenario is worth considering. Because when we look back at 2022, we saw something slightly similar. Bitcoin rallied during the first week of March, and then the market stalled and moved sideways. That sideways movement allowed the indicators to cool off, and then later in the month, Bitcoin made one more push higher, sweeping the highs before eventually rolling over. So if history rhymes, the move we saw during the first week of March might be the phase one of the rally. After that, we could see Bitcoin go sideways to cool off these indicators before making one more push higher, sweeping this high we made in the first week by the end of March. And if that happens, the best case scenario for this rally will probably still be around this bear market resistance band. Now, there's also something I've seen a lot of people post about on X recently. Some people are looking at this death cross that we recently got on the 3-day time frame. A death cross is basically when a shorter term moving average crosses below a longer term moving average, often the 50 moving average crossing below the 200. Historically, when we get this death cross on the 3-day time frame, it has ended up with a sharp move to the downside. We actually saw something similar happen in 2022, and after we got this death cross, we eventually saw a sharp move down. When you look at other midterm years, there's also examples where similar signals led to major downside moves. So it's definitely something to keep in mind. But personally, I still think a major crash right now doesn't really make sense. Maybe later in the cycle, sure, but at this exact moment, it doesn't really line up with what the indicators are telling us. A lot of these indicators are sitting at historical lows, and when that happens, we tend to see a relief rally or some sort of reset for these indicators. That's also why I think it makes sense that we might sweep this high that we got in the first week of March before we eventually get a move lower. But let's also talk about where the next potential lower low could be, because if Bitcoin eventually rolls over, like it has done in previous midterm years, the next question becomes, when could the next lower low actually happen? If we compare this to 2014 and 2018 and assume that the rally only lasts the first week of March, then the next low could appear sometime in early April. In 2014, the next low came around April 10th. In 2018, it appeared around April 1st. But if we look at the 2022 structure, which in many ways looks very similar to how things have played out so far, then the timeline could stretch further. Back in 2022, the next major lower low didn't appear until June. Now, some people might say it's difficult to compare these cycles because the previous one had a stronger euphoria phase at the top, but when you look at the data, the second top in 2022 wasn't actually full-blown euphoria either. It was more of a secondary peak, and structurally it makes it more comparable to what we are seeing right now happening. So realistically, the next lower low could happen sometime around April till June. And historically, after we get this lower low, Bitcoin follows it with another counter-trend rally. So if it ends up making a lower low between April and June, it wouldn't be surprising to see this counter-trend rally. That's simply the rhythm Bitcoin tends to follow during this part of the cycle. But again, personally, I don't think we are going to see a major drop immediately right now. That doesn't mean price can't go lower eventually, because I do think sometime later in the bear market, a lower low is very possible. But based on where the indicators are sitting right now, it feels like we are likely going to see a stronger rally or some sideways consolidations to help these indicators. So to summarize how I'm currently looking at the market, I think the best case scenario from here is a sideways consolidation before we get a sweep of the high by the end of March around the bear market resistance band. After that, Bitcoin is eventually gonna roll over and find a lower low between April or June. That's the period I'm personally going to be looking for signs of a lower low. But of course, the market rarely falls in the script perfectly. We are just going to have to see how the price is going to behave over the coming weeks. And as always, I'll keep you guys updated if I see anything interesting appearing. So if you enjoyed this video, remember to like and subscribe. Comment down below what I can do better. I love to hear from you guys. And remember, in markets like these, patience isn't passive, it's an advantage. I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.